Open up a classical piano compilation and, odds are, there will be lying within a rag by Scott Joplin. But hang on, isn't this the kind of music they play in American barrooms, not concert halls? Which begs for me a rather awkward question. Is Scott Joplin actually classical music? Scott Joplin is the master of ragtime, a musical form that emerged from the black communities of America at the end of the 19th century and swept the country in a nationwide, you might even say worldwide craze. Ragtime was a hugely important early influence on the development of jazz, blues, boogie-woogie, swing, and so many types of popular music. So, popular music, tick, but the question remains, is Scott Joplin classical music? If you'd asked this question of Joplin himself, you would have got a categorical yes. The child of freed slaves, Joplin came from a musical family and from a young age showed an unnatural musical ability. I'd love to show you pictures of this, but of course we don't have any. Indeed, we only have 3 or 4 verified pictures of Scott Joplin at all. We do, however, know a few details about his upbringing. Joplin's mother was determined to give her son every educational opportunity possible. So, she took cleaning work in homes that owned a piano and which allowed her talented child to practice as she worked. Joplin's abilities were soon noticed by a German-born musician called Julius Weiss. He agreed to give young Joplin free lessons in the classical music traditions of Europe, lessons that lasted for several years, and lessons which surely centred Joplin's understanding of music. As a young man, and against the wishes of his father, Joplin decided to make a career of music and was both swept up in and became a leading innovator in the musical form of ragtime. Joplin spent a decade itinerant on the road before he got his first hit, but when he got his first hit in 1897, it was a biggie. His Maple Leaf Rag, named after the Maple Leaf Club where he played, where he was known as the Entertainer, quickly became one of the most popular pieces in America. This is the era before recordings. Sheet music was how composers and publishers earned their money. And Joplin had been fortunate in the agreement he made with his publisher, John Stark, to receive 1 cent for every copy of the Maple Leaf Rag sold. It was a relatively generous contract for the time. The success of the Maple Leaf Rag, still one of Joplin's most famous compositions, continues to this day. The tune didn't make Joplin fabulously wealthy, but it meant he was reasonably comfortable for most of his adult life, although his final years were shrouded in failure and obscurity. Over the next 2 decades, Joplin would compose over 40 rags. He sincerely believed in ragtime as a new musical form for his age. He had helped to birth the art form, and now he curated and consolidated it. For example, after 1905, Joplin almost always printed on his compositions, "Do not play this piece fast. It is never right to play ragtime fast." He hated flashy players that played rag too rapidly, losing the subtle syncopations of the music in a desire to show off with speed. However, opposition to ragtime music was growing in a way that would have parallels with jazz, rock and rap many years later. Music that emerged from black communities and that was deemed as potentially dangerous. As one critic claimed, ragtime was a poison that destroys the musical minds of the young. Even in black music circles, there was real opposition to this new emerging music. A writer in the Negro Musical Journal wrote in 1902, "Let us take a united stand against the ragtime evil, as we would against bad literature, intemperance, and other socially destructive evils." People even claimed, and this is true, that syncopation could cause permanent brain damage. What? None of this troubled Joplin, who believed ragtime was a new musical form that could operate within the classical tradition. Indeed, Joplin would spend the last 2 decades of his life attempting to do just that, fighting to get ragtime accepted by the classical world. Joplin's first attempt to consciously fuse ragtime with classical music was with ballet, with the Ragtime Dance, composed in 1902. Joplin's publisher, John Stark, didn't think the music was commercially viable, and he only published the work after much arguing and haranguing from Joplin. Stark may have been correct. The work was ultimately unsuccessful. Joplin forced his disappointment aside and turned to one of his favourite genres of classical music, opera, with Treemonisha, composed between 1907 and 1910. Again, Joplin could find nobody to publish or produce his work, and ended up doing so himself. He managed to organise an informal production of the work, but nothing came of it, and Joplin struggled for the rest of his life to get the work performed or even recognised. Joplin's attempts to fuse classical traditions with ragtime had proved ultimately unsuccessful. It was a failure from which Joplin himself never really recovered. By 1916, Joplin, a serious and hard-working professional, was acting increasingly paranoid, almost certainly the result of syphilis he may have picked up in the less than salubrious venues in which he used to perform. The composer died in 1917, aged only 48. Ragtime, by then, was well out of fashion, and Joplin, an unknown figure, had faded into obscurity. He was buried in an unmarked grave. I wonder if Joplin might have been more successful with a more supportive background and a full musical tradition working behind him, and probably just a bit more time. No need for cleaning houses with pianos. Gershwin's family were reasonably well off, indeed buying a piano for their children when George was just 11. Like Joplin, Gershwin also attempted to straddle classical and popular music, but Gershwin was more successful. He composed his folk opera Porgy and Bess in 1935, several years younger than Joplin was when he composed his folk opera Treemonisha. The scoring for Porgy and Bess is detailed and complex, Gershwin having taken numerous composition and harmony lessons from wherever he could get them. Joplin received limited, if any, help writing Treemonisha. Indeed, the full score itself has now unfortunately been lost. Gershwin's work also featured a libretto written by his lyricist brother Ira Gershwin and the playwright Edwin Dubose Hayward. Joplin, on the other hand, had written the entire story and libretto of Treemonisha on his own. Joplin was culturally isolated. Where were the talented contemporaries to compete against, to influence or be influenced by, to hate, to secretly admire? Where were the masters of his craft? Where were the teachers? Dvorak was in America at the end of the 19th century, but he unfortunately never met Joplin, who was still an unknown when the Czech composer left America in 1895. New York, 2 decades later, and Rachmaninoff and John Philip Sousa are attending the premiere of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. It must have been so much harder for Joplin, not just because of his race and upbringing, but also the timing. By the time of Joplin's death in 1917, ragtime had long become old-fashioned and the composer's reputation had faded into obscurity, just as the worlds of jazz and the American musical were emerging into busy life. Joplin reportedly said towards the end of his life, "When I'm dead 25 years, people are going to begin to recognise me." He was wrong. It took a little longer, close to 50 years, but there was indeed a ragtime revival in the 1970s. Joplin was duly recognised, and soon his popular rags would start appearing in those piano compilations I mentioned at the start of this video. Oh, and that headstone I showed you earlier? That was put there in the 1970s as well. So, is ragtime classical music? Isn't it a popular jazzy style of piano? A kind of great-grandfather of boogie-woogie? does Joplin really deserve his place alongside Chopin and Beethoven in those piano compilations? Yes, of course he does. Joplin based his music on classical forms. He wrote it down in classical notation to be played on a classical instrument. And most importantly, it's rather good. And besides, classical music is a lovely and rather huge tent that happily welcomes Scott Joplin inside. It's lovely to have these rags to enjoy now, but it does just feel a shame, and this is for me personally, that Joplin didn't produce more music, but even more variety. His later rags like Solace and The Magnetic Rag reach further musically, and I think they're his best work. I just wish he'd done more like that. I just wish there was more. Scott Joplin was a flower, a lone flower, blooming in a desert that would, a few years after his death, itself blossom into life, loudly. Please like and subscribe.